Today on the Where Traveler podcast, our host Teresa Rodriguez talks with historian, author, lecturer John Arturo Martini. He was practically preordained for his occupation, and he dove right into it, taking a path in his life that solidified his purpose to capture and relate the rich history of San Francisco and its surroundings. John's family came to San Francisco in 1849. How could his story start any better than to be the descendant of actual 49ers? And his family established their roots. They branched into almost every important industry in California's cultivation. They were miners, ranchers, sheep herders, bankers, bartenders, and even owned a deli. And they passed stories down around the dinner table through the generations. These stories of the roles that his forebears played in the development of this great region fascinated John and instilled in him a responsibility to keep the details alive and vibrant. That sense of responsibility led him to a calling as a national park ranger, where he was stationed in the most enviable places like Pearl Harbor. But lucky for us, he spent much of his career right where his family's legacy was steeped around San Francisco, the Presidio, the Marin Headlands, and Alcatraz, and where his own work as a writer and historian could go deep, to flourish, and to fascinate us. John Martini has written several books about military history and about the specific parts of San Francisco that fascinate those in the know. He gives captivating lectures in and around these places, at events and historical walking tours, in the kind of intimate detail that brings you through a time and an experience that drives home the importance of these locations and the part that they played in the growth of our country, our economy, and our beautiful culture. As he puts it, he helps us to discover or rediscover San Francisco and its many stories. And as a storyteller, he plants the seeds that make us all take a piece of responsibility and a bit of appreciation for the work of those who toiled before us to make the San Francisco Bay Area a mecca of wonderful diversity and the land of opportunity. Here is our host, Teresa Rodriguez, and our very special guest, John Arturo Martini.
You're listening to the Where Traveler podcast, the audio companion for Where Traveler magazine in print and online. For more information, go to wheretraveler.com. And now, Teresa Rodriguez, Editor-in-Chief for Where Traveler San Francisco.
Hi, this is Teresa Rodriguez, and we're back with Where Traveler podcast. I have such a fascinating guest with me right now. We're talking about Alcatraz. And if anybody knows about Alcatraz, it's this gentleman, John Martini. He knows about the island before it was actually a prison. So, John, welcome to Where Traveler Podcast.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks for taking time out.
Sure.
So let's start. What was Alcatraz before it was Alcatraz?
It was a rock. It was literally a 22-acre rock in the middle of San Francisco Bay. The Native American tribes, as best we know, didn't even have a name for it.
Really?
It was just, well, they knew good real estate when they saw it, and Alcatraz wasn't good real estate.
Yeah, because it seems like it wouldn't have any natural running water.
No water, no vegetation.
Yeah.
The only wildlife were migratory birds that would roost on it. Didn't even have firewood. There's just nothing to attract you there when you think you have the whole of Marin County and the East Bay, San Francisco. Alcatraz, which was one of a number of big empty rocks in the bay, it seemed to have no prehistory that we've been able to determine. Some secondhand legends that essentially the Native Americans, probably with good reason, considered the island just to have bad karma. And,
interesting.
Yeah.
So tell us about that bad karma that they thought it had.
It's really kind of undefined, except that it was, I don't want to use anything dramatic like evil spirits, but just that it was a place to be avoided. Yeah. And a lot of these things come out of the natural hazards of the island. It didn't even have a beach on it. And when you're navigating San Francisco Bay in a bundle of tules as a canoe, pretty formidable. This giant rock covered with screaming seabirds and waves crashing all around it. I'd definitely head for someplace like Angel Island. That was a lot more welcoming.
I didn't realize that it didn't have a beach. That's so fascinating.
No, the earliest maps and drawings made by Americans in the 1840s show the island as just precipitous all around. One little teeny cove right where the boat docks today was little pocket, maybe just big enough for you to bring in a rowboat.
Huh.
That was it. The early Spanish maps of San Francisco Bay show that there were a number of big unnamed islands in the harbor. And this is really history nerd stuff. One of the early Spanish maps shows the name Isla de los Alcatraces.
Oh.
Means island of pelicans.
Pelicans.
But it's not on the island that we call Alcatraz. The name was next to the island that we now call Yerba Buena.
Huh. So how did it end up with the name Alcatraz?
Apparently a map maker's error.
Huh.
Yeah. The British Navy surveyed and made an excellent map of San Francisco Bay in the 1820s. And at that point, the name Alcatraces, it gets changed to Alcatrazes, misspelled, and it's relocated. Just a map maker error.
That's so fascinating.
It still had no use, neither the Native Americans nor the Spanish nor the Mexicans when this was Mexican California. Did anybody have any use for Alcatraz? Somebody did manage to get title to it in the very last days when Mexico was still ruling California. He got a title to the island with the provision he built a lighthouse on it.
Okay.
He never did. So when the United States took over California, they just absorbed the island in the middle of the bay as being government land. If this guy, his name was Julian Workman, if he, showed up with a title, the first thing they would have asked was, where's the lighthouse?
Where's the lighthouse, right?
And null and void.
Wow, that's fascinating. So how did it evolve to become a prison?
Location, location, location. Really, being in the middle of the bay, it was... It attracted the government's attention first for the same reason the Mexican government, they wanted a lighthouse on it. And when the gold rush kicked in, so many ships are coming into San Francisco Bay, it was critical. You needed a light.
That's true.
Yeah. And at that time, the island, it had various names. Everyone was mispronouncing Alcatraz. The most common name seems to have been either Bird Island or White Island or Bird Guano Island. And they said you could smell it before you could see it. But
right.
So they put a lighthouse on it in the 1850s. Simultaneously, as the lighthouse board's looking at it, the U.S. Army's going, it's like a floating battleship.
Right.
A non-floating battleship. It's a solid rock battleship in the middle of the harbor. Sandstone.
Huh.
Really crummy sandstone. You can't quarry it. You can hit it with a hammer and it shatters.
Huh.
So the U.S. Army carved their way at the island. They tunneled into the rock, and they turned it into a major fortress during the gold rush.
Oh, during the gold rush. So that was the first time it was used, utilized.
Sure. A timeline would be the Army starts digging away at the island in 1853. A year later, the Lighthouse Board, separate entities in the government, they built a lighthouse on top of the island. And the first soldiers arrive, and they raise the American flag in the year 1859. That first day that the Army is calling the place Fort Alcatraz, or the Fort on Alcatraz Island, they've got 11 guys in chains out there.
What?
Prisoners, they were part of the every Army post, they have a little prison. Because when you have an Army that's made up of young men that, especially during the California Gold Rush, drinking, gambling, maybe trying to desert, the first day the island opens, 11 guys are undergoing punishment.
Wow.
The island wasn't intended to be a prison. It was intended that it was a fort with cannon and gun emplacements and barracks buildings, but they had what's called a guardhouse with 11 guys locked up. We don't know what they did. My suspicion is very likely the most common thing in those days was trying to go AWOL to look for gold.
Oh, really?
That's how it started. Alcatraz is supposedly a fort. Reality is all the other Army posts all over the country. If you ever see those old Western movies, you have these frontier Army posts where they're, having battles with Native American tribes. Soldiers from all over the West, if they were real screw-up soldiers, prisoners, they'd send them to Alcatraz.
Wow. So it was like Australia.
In a way.
Yeah.
In a way.
It was our little tiny Australia.
Except they weren't supposed to settle there and become good citizens afterwards. They were just there to be punished.
Really?
Yeah. The island never saw a battle. Although during the Civil War, it was loaded with cannon and soldiers waiting for enemies that never came. And as time went by, simply there were fewer and fewer cannons. Technology's changing. Other forts are being built in other places. But the prison's growing. And you get to the turn of the 20th century, and there's a handful of cannon on the island, and there's 400 Army soldier prisoners.
Wow.
They're coming from as far away as the Philippines and Hawaii, Alaska. Alcatraz was the official U.S. Army military prison.
Wow.
It's not a pretty story because you don't want to think of U.S. Army military personnel breaking military law and being locked up as prisoners.
Right.
But they were.
Right.
And they're the ones that shaped Alcatraz. They made it look the way it did, breaking rock, chipping away at that sandstone, digging roads. They hauled over boatloads of dirt from the mainland and from Marin County.
Oh, that's how they got the dirt there.
That's right. Somebody gave us a photo album taken in 1911, 1912, and family photo album.
I'm Teresa Rodriguez, Editor-in-Chief of Where San Francisco, and you're listening to Where Travel Podcast, where we love to talk about anything related to travel. For more information about this episode, as well as Where Traveler, be sure to check out wheretraveler.com.
Somebody gave us a photo album taken in 1911, 1912, and family photo album. There's images we'd never seen, but one of them I found especially fascinating was a big barge full of dirt at the Alcatraz dock and a whole row of little guys with wheelbarrows just trundling dirt around the island, filling it up. Other guys were smashing rocks. The old expression was turning big rocks into little ones, used for gravel. And as time went by, the Army went through a period when it's not a fort. It's a prison.
It's a prison. Okay.
We're making it a euphemism.
Right.
They changed the name to U.S. Disciplinary Barracks.
U.S. Disciplinary Barracks, huh?
And it was soldier prisoners who built the building on Alcatraz that became the penitentiary. It was finished in 1912. It was 22 years later that Al Capone arrived.
Okay. Wow. 22 years later. Now, why did they choose Alcatraz to put Al Capone there? When there was other prisons, right?
Sure. What's happening in the 1920s is, you've ever seen all the crime movies.
Right.
You had Bonnie and Clyde, mobile gangsters, and you had urban mobsters. Capone was the poster boy for the urban monster.
Right.
Urban mobster.
Mobster, but I like that little slip.
Yeah. Well, the brand new Bureau of Prisons, brand new United States government agency that was administering the existing federal penitentiaries at Leavenworth, Kansas, and McNeil Island, Washington, Atlanta. They were tasked with handling this huge upsurge of really bad people that were ending up in federal prisons for breaking federal law. So they decided they would take one prison where they would send the worst of the worst. And the expression, it's attributed to J. Edgar Hoover, was they were going to take all the rotten apples, put them in one barrel, and nail the lid on.
Wow, and that was Alcatraz.
That was Alcatraz. The Army was more than happy to get rid of the island. It was aging. It cost a lot of money. Just like another one of your guests said, it was just falling apart. The salt water was eating everything. The Bureau of Prisons was looking for a prison, and for public relations purposes, it was perfect. It's right in the middle of the busiest harbor on the West Coast, and you can put these infamous people out there, and one writer said you could bury them alive in plain view. There was almost no media allowed on the island. Rumors were coming out, but it was like sort of like a Guantanamo at one time. You really didn't know what was going on because there was like this lit of secrecy on the island. Because the Bureau of Prisons wanted the island to be a deterrent. Not to necessarily would-be bad guys in the civilian population, but people already in the federal prison system. If you screw up, you're going to send you to Alcatraz.
Wow. And
you'll be cut off from everything. In the earliest days, the bleakest first 6 years, letters were censored, reread, retyped, so you couldn't use a code.
Redacted letters?
Yeah, Wow. For many years, you couldn't even talk, aside from in the recreation yard or, at work, hand me a hammer. No conversations in the cells, no conversations while you're moving chains. The years of silence. Visitation was limited to one family member or your lawyer once a month for half an hour.
Yeah, that would kind of make sense because it'd be pretty hard to get out there, right? So
it was. for a lot of people who were doing time out there, they're from the Midwest, their families Midwest or East Coast,
Right.
to travel clear across the United States for 30 minutes once a month. Many guys never got visitors. And that was the thing. Alcatraz started to get this reputation as being some horrific place.
Yeah.
You talk to people on both sides of the bars that were out there, and they'll pretty much tell you that it was by the book. But it was probably one of the best run penitentiaries there was. The worst thing about it was bleak. There was nothing to relieve the sameness.
Yeah.
Every day was exactly like every other, except for maybe church services on Sunday. And something they really look forward to is Christmas.
Wow.
There'd be Christmas music playing. Every convict got a little bag of candy. And that was about it. Most guys wanted off there more than anything else they possibly could. And being released from Alcatraz generally meant you went back to the prison you came from.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. A few guys finished their whole sentences and went out to San Francisco. And one guy I interviewed said he'd been on the island for like 7 years, totally cut off because he didn't have newspapers.
Right.
Yeah. And they released him at, the foot of Venice Avenue in San Francisco where the boat came in. And the cars are going by and there's people on rock and roll. And it's like, it was he like from another planet.
Yeah, time machine. That's so fascinating.
I've been around long enough. I got to interview some of the cons that were there in the 1930s. And there was one guy that I interviewed. He was a local San Francisco boy who had really had a horrific time. And he was considered to be the worst con on Alcatraz, the most dangerous. It was Charlie Berta. Charlie Berta, when I asked him about, what was, he went on, it was the best place I ever did time.
Really?
The views were wonderful. And you had the fresh, because he'd been in some hellholes. To him, Alcatraz was a piece of cake.
Really?
Yeah.
And how was the food? Because it seems like getting food there would be a bit of a...
Classically in penitentiaries, prisons, food is what causes riots and fights, and everybody's in the mess hall, the chow hall together. There's food, there's hundreds of people, and they've got cutlery. So to head off the problem, Alcatraz had the reputation of being the best feeder in the beer prisons.
So it had really good food there.
Well,
great food and fabulous views.
It was better than the others.
Right.
But they said it was monotonous though, because it just kept repeating. You had to buy in bulk numbers. It was okay prepared. One thing is that you take all you want.
Oh,
but eat all you take.
Oh, eat all you take.
Yeah, because that would get you a stretch in isolation, solitary confinement, if wasting food. Because otherwise you'd have guys, loading up their plate, just throwing it away.
Wow.
So it was the hardcore reputation. It was hardcore.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like these terrible movies that came out in the 1930s portrayed Alcatraz.
Right.
We call that era the Hellcatraz era.
Hellcatraz.
Partly because there was so little that was known. Convicts that were on the island and then transferred out and eventually got released, they were all selling their stories to the media.
Yeah, good idea. I love it. Now, you're looking at Alcatraz now, is there any things that you would like to see happen to the island? Would you like to see it turned into a resort? I mean, what... what would you... are you happy with the fact that it's a national park? Or, is there any better thans? Or...
I was lucky enough to start there within a couple of weeks of when we first opened it to the public in 1973.
That's amazing.
I grew up looking at Alcatraz, and I saw a documentary about Alcatraz on television made right after it closed, and they were photographing all over the island, and I remember just stuck in my memory as a 12-year-old, they did a long, tight pan into this big, giant, bricked-up doorway, and the narrator said, to this day, no one knows what lies behind this sealed door.
Right.
And I had to find out. And maybe that's how I got the bug to research Alcatraz.
Yeah.
I want people to learn that, it looms huge in America penology.
It does.
Partly because of the reputation earned through the media,
right? Hollywood,
books, partly because it's an experiment that didn't work. That's why they shut it down.
Got it.
If it was really successful, they would have found the money to keep it going. I like people to know that penology is advanced in some ways, but in fact, Alcatraz, you talk to a lot of the former inmates, it's a lot better than penitentiaries today. There were no gangs to speak of.
Wow.
I'll quote one of the guys. He said that when he was there in the early 50s, he said the cons they had class, they had style. They didn't need gangs. He said if you had a beef with another guy, you worked it out mano a mano in the rec yard.
Wow.
Oh, stabbings took place, violence. There were some drugs, mostly homemade, illegal brew out there. But nothing like no Aryan Nation, no Christian Brotherhood, no gangs, racially based.
Right. That's so fascinating. So there, you told us that there are some hidden tunnels. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about this, because this is so fascinating to me. During the gold rush, they dug out tunnels? Yeah, during the gold rush, they were turning Alcatraz into a impregnable fort, so that if anyone attacks San Francisco, this island, this rock, is going to be able to hold out, keep any ships from entering the harbor. It's a cork in San Francisco Bay. Uh-huh. And because it had no natural water or anything else, they dug underground cisterns. They dug underground ammunition storage rooms that are called magazines. Uh-huh. They dug a couple of called communication tunnels. There's one's about 150 feet long, goes clear across the island. And as time went by, and the island's evolving away from being a fort, sometimes the walls were 5 feet thick, made of granite or brick, of these old fortifications. Well, they made just Jim Dandy foundations for the later era prison buildings. And we're finding that the basements of these buildings contain parts of the old fortifications. The Bureau of Prisons used some of the underground rooms underneath the cell house as dungeon cells. What? Yeah. The big prison itself was built on top of a massive brick barracks building for soldiers. And when the concrete prison was constructed, they left the basement behind, and this labyrinth of underground rooms were perfect for either dead storage or storing people. Really?
Underground solitary confinement. And the term that was thrown around constantly in use was they were dungeons. Wow. Complete with, if the oral histories are correct, no need to doubt them, locked in the dark, bread and water diets, sometimes chained for up to 14 days at a stretch.
Whoa. That's a long time.
And some other spaces were just blocked off, literally bricked up, like that doorway that fascinated me. And these rooms gave rise to legends. And the convicts would repeat these legends over and over. They took on a life of their own. They were called Spanish tunnels or Spanish dungeons. And the convict lore was the island is just crisscrossed with, tunnels. And if you could just break into them, you could magically find your way to freedom. Okay. And what you're seeing here is the genesis of that movie called The Rock. Right. Which was all made up of whole cloth. The reality was more brutal and more simple. Huh. But we're still finding structures that were buried on the island intact.
That's fascinating. That's so fascinating. Mm-hmm. So what would you recommend is the best way for visitor? Is there a specific tour that you would recommend, or do you do tours to the Rock? Or?
I go out occasionally, maybe once a month, and I lead guided programs.
Oh, fantastic.
I tell people, go out, take the audio tour, see the cell house, see the prison. That audio tour, I had the privilege of working on that about 25 years ago when it was put together, finding the survivors that we interviewed.
Oh, fantastic.
Because these aren't actors. These are the real voices of the people that did time or that worked there.
Oh, my God.
Edited together. Once you've done that, see the rest of Alcatraz. Go see the gardens. There's a whole army of garden volunteers who've clawed back to life the gardens that were planted by the convicts and by the families of the guard staff. Yeah. They take an underground tour, check the daily events board, and see if they're offering tours. So we call it the Citadel.
The Citadel.
Because the Citadel is the area that was left behind that was used as underground solitary. Wow. Right now we're in the middle of bird nesting season. Wow. And plenty of, obnoxious full-grown gulls, pecking at you because you're getting too close to their nests. The other story is what about the Native American occupation that started 50 years ago this November. Right. It was just before Thanksgiving.
That's right, I remember.
And it's a major turning point in modern Native American cultural politics. It was the first time that the Indians of all tribes, as they called themselves, that many different tribes had come together for a single purpose since Little Bighorn.
So when you say that, you're talking about the Cherokees and all the different tribes or whatever that are getting together.
Yep.
And they're not fighting against each other. They are uniting.
But unfortunately, the tribes that weren't invited to the dance were the San Francisco tribes. And that's still kind of a sore point. It's a fascinating story of politics and 60s upheaval and Black power, Chicano power, Red power.
Right.
It was a media event, and it peaked quickly, and then it unfortunately deteriorated, and it's still debated.
Can you just tell our listeners about this, what happened, when it happened, and how they got to the island and how?
Sure. By 1969, the island had been closed for 6 years. The government had been unable to give it to any other government agency. Everybody went, it costs how much? And the state of California wasn't interested in it. They were looking at actually selling it, and the city of San Francisco was really pushing the idea of selling it and turning it into a convention center.
Oh, God.
Big Texas money was going to fund this thing. And simultaneously, the Native Americans in the Bay Area, there was quite a few number of Native Americans, especially college age, who had come from reservations, college students, and they had been apparently promised different types of support that weren't happening. And just like everybody else was getting media attention, I had mentioned Chicano power, Red power, Black power. They wanted to do something dramatic to get attention to their plight.
Right.
And as I understand it, they talked about things like, chain ourselves to the Golden Gate Bridge. No, somebody else did that. We need something high profile.
We did.
And somebody said,
bigger and better.
Let's take over Alcatraz. Because they realized there was only one security guard at night. They made a first attempt, and they found out how easy it was. They were thrown off almost immediately, but they realized, piece of cake. They just showed up in very large numbers one night in mid-November 1969. Whoever the guard was on duty, called his boss, and it went up the chain of command, apparently to the White House. And somebody in the Nixon White House said, don't do anything. There was enough trouble. There have been riots in Chicago, students being beaten by cops on television. The way it was explained to me, somebody said, we don't need a bloodbath over Alcatraz.
Right.
And just let it play itself out. And the Indians, the older organizers were stunned. They fully expected to be arrested, and this was going to be their moment. And instead, they've got Alcatraz. And the word went out. And this is when the Indians of all tribes started to show up.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So great. What a great story.
Yeah, Thanksgiving 1969, they had a huge feast in the recreation yard.
Wow, what a great story. You have some fantastic stories. John Martini, thank you for your time. How can our listeners find you? I
have a website, johnamartini.com. I had to put the A in because some other guy who owns a bar in Key West, Florida, got johnmartini.com. johnamartini.com. I'm on Twitter at johnamartini.
Fantastic.
Yeah, would love to answer questions. Love to talk to people. So thanks for inviting me.
Well, thank you so much. This is Teresa Rodriguez with Where Traveler Podcast, and we've been at Alcatraz. Thank you, listeners, for joining me. You've been listening to the Where Traveler Podcast, hosted by me, Teresa Rodriguez. This episode was produced and directed by Pete A. Turner, John Leon Guerrero, and Victoria Shepard. To listen to this podcast, find out more information about the crew, as well as Where Traveler, visit wheretraveler.com, your ultimate destination guide.